Today's focus will be on nuclear power, and in particular, power that is generated in Illinois. In fact, 48% of all of our electric generation originates from nuclear power in Illinois. If you look at this map on the right-hand side of Illinois, and you notice we live about there, let's say, you should also notice that we live extremely close to 3 nuclear power plants. And why do you think we have these power plants that are so close to this general area, to Chicago? Well, you should consider this. What does Chicago need a lot of? Well, it needs a lot of power, right? It needs a lot of electric power. And what nuclear power can do is it can provide a lot of power without producing a lot of smoke and smog and pollutants. So nuclear power definitely is a great resource for Chicago to generate all of its electrical needs. If you look at this data table, what you should notice is that it talks about electrical generation. So how do we produce electricity? And this in particular one is about nuclear. Now, if you look at it, all of these guys are all power plants that are found in Illinois. Illinois actually has the most power plants, nuclear power plants in the entire United States. And even though these say that they were closing, they actually canned that idea and they have kept them open due to the demand being still so high for nuclear power. All right, we're going to focus a little bit on the ones that are right by where we live. The first one is Braidwood. Braidwood is just a little bit south on where 80 meets 55, and you just go a little bit south on 55, and there you are at Braidwood. Okay, and then this is an image of it. So if you're ever interested, you could drive by and you'll see the Braidwood station. Byron is located a little bit in northern Illinois. It's 110 miles west of Chicago, and it actually produces enough electricity for 2 million homes. Dresden produces enough energy for 1.5 million homes. What's interesting about Dresden is that it was made in 1960, and it was the first full scale, which means that it's fully running, fully functioning, privately financed nuclear power plant. So it's not run by the government. It is owned by a private company where they generate the electricity and distribute it. We have LaSalle. LaSalle is located 75 miles southwest of Chicago. So once again, you'll notice that everything's right by Chicago, and you will notice that they are all nuclear power within a relative easy transportation of this electrical energy to get to Chicago. All right, let's talk a little bit more about specifics within the nuclear power plant itself. We talked about the general, how a nuclear power plant works, but let's talk about the specifics, especially when you're talking about the fuel reactors. Okay, so the fuel reactors are made of these tiny, tiny little fuel pellets. So if you look on this drawing or this image, you will see these little fuel pellets. Okay, so this is made out of enriched uranium, and they each have about an 18-month durability, meaning they'll cycle them through after about 18 months. Okay, in order to do one fuel rod, you need over 193 of these fuel pellets. So what they do is they kind of like stack on top of each other, and you get one fuel rod. So a fuel rod is not one continuous fuel pellet. It is actually made up of all these little fuel pellets stacked on top of each other. Okay, and here's a fuel assembly. So within each rod, so here's your rod. Oop, that's a bad circling job. Within these rods, you will have 193 plus fuel pellets. So you put those pellets within those rods. Then what you do is you put those rods within an assembly. Okay, and you'll have about, let's say it rounded, if you look at it, it's 179 to 264. So let's say even just 200 rods, okay, within one assembly. And then within one core, you'll have between 121 and 193 of these guys. So you are talking a lot of fuel pellets within one core. So what are some pros of nuclear energy? Well, there's a lot of pros. It gets a lot of bad slack because of the dangers if something goes wrong, but nuclear energy is a great transition between being totally renewable and being dependent on fossil fuels, okay? Why? First off, it doesn't emit carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is done by a combustion reaction, which is when you burn those hydrocarbons. Because you're not burning anything with nuclear energy, it is actually undergoing not a chemical change, but a fission reaction. You're not having any of these products of carbon dioxide, which deal with the greenhouse gases. Okay, they also do not emit any of these pollutants, such as ash, soot, and SO2. This makes your acid rain. So it doesn't release any of those pollutants that the coal and the natural gas will release. We also have a huge supply of uranium fuel. Remember, uranium fuel is used in these fuel rods. And so we have a lot of resources left. Unlike oil, where we're running out, we have still quite a bit of uranium fuel. Unlike renewables, it provides a constant amount of electricity. So does oil, not oil because we don't use oil for electrical generation, but so does natural gas, and so does coal. They are constant electricity. Renewables are dependent on, let's say, wind and the sun, and so because it's not dependent on anything, you can consistently rely on it. Okay, operating costs are actually low. To start it, it's very expensive, but once you're up and running, it's actually extremely cheap source of energy. And new plants are safer and more efficient than the older plants, so it's even becoming a better and better process than it used to be in the 1960s, 1970s. And a huge one is that it reduces your dependence on foreign oil. So we don't have to go to wars for oil. We don't have to go search out for oil. We have all of these resources in the United States, so we wouldn't need to depend on other countries for that. That being said, there are still some cons to nuclear power. First off, the cost of an actual plant is extremely high and very political. Okay, like what do you do with this spent fuel? Do you put it in which state's going to be volunteering and saying, "Oh, I'll take your waste of nuclear power plants"? I mean, nobody's really going to want to do that because nuclear power plants that spent fuel is extremely dangerous. It is very radioactive. So nobody's wanting to volunteer to take on this. So what do you do with that stuff? They do take longer to build because of all these safety measures that they have to deal with compared to coal and natural gas plants. So if you need a quick fix, nuclear power is not your resource that you're going to do. What else are you going to do with the spent fuel? That's a huge concern. And the equipment needs. Where is it going to be stored? Who's going to volunteer to store it? And even if somebody volunteers, what's going to happen to that land and all that other stuff? The public attitude is sometimes negative towards it. In fact, a lot of people are very fearful towards it. Why? Because it releases radiation. They hear terms like Chernobyl and nuclear meltdown, and they obviously don't want to volunteer to have that experience in their backyard. So we've got this negative attitude towards it. Uranium can be enriched and made into nuclear weapons. Those are what we used on our atomic bombs that we dropped in Japan. So we can enrich this uranium that we use in the fuel rods, and you can use them for nuclear weapons. Okay, so once you have the source of uranium, if you enrich it further and further and further, which is a very complicated process, it is not easy, but it can be done and they can be used then for nuclear weapons later. Most plants that we have in the United States, in particular those in Illinois, are extremely old and need upgrades, and that is extremely costly. Okay, so who's willing to front that money to upgrade it to make it as safe and efficient as we possibly can? And then once again, as we've stated with the spent fuel rods and the equipment, the long-term environmental impact is unknown. We just started using nuclear power. We discovered it. We harnessed it in the 1940s for the Manhattan Project to deal with the atomic bomb. And so it's a relatively new resource that we're using to generate this electric power. So we don't actually know the long-term environmental impacts of this. All right, hopefully you understand that after this video, Illinois has quite a bit of nuclear power within its area. And the reason why is because it has a lot of pros and we can generate a lot of electricity that we need for Chicago. There are still some cons for nuclear power that you will absolutely need to know. All right, have a great day.